Brother Ron, and welcome to We All Be News Radio and TV, the news-free Dixie for the 21st century.
We All Be Radio is proud to have on with us today a true advocate for the people, Brother Jeffrey Haas, who is the lawyer for Chairman Fred Hampton and also wrote this terrific account of that wonderful experience called The Assassination of Fred Hampton, how the FBI and the Chicago police murdered a Black Panther. And also he's a founder of another living legacy as well, the People's Law Office out of Chicago. It's an honor to have you on, sir. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed reading your book, The Assassination of Fred Hampton. I'd like to know, what was your inspiration in becoming a lawyer?
Well, I entered law school really not sure why I wanted to be a lawyer. I kind of didn't know what else to do, and my father and grandfather had been lawyers. When I came out of law school, I took a job with the legal aid in Chicago, and I got involved in many of the issues in the Black community, and I saw some of the mistreatment that was going on in terms of police brutality, in terms of housing, and so forth. And then I was very moved by the civil rights movement of the period. I heard Dr. King speak in Chicago, and by the anti-war movement. All of those things directed me towards first becoming a lawyer and then deciding that I wanted to be a lawyer for the people.
And also your background, both your grandfather and your father was lawyers, correct?
That is right. So I guess I had it in my blood, but I still wasn't sure what kind of lawyer I wanted to be when I entered law school, which was 64. By 67, things had escalated. There was a Black Power movement. The anti-war movement had escalated. And by that time, I think I wanted to make my legal skills, useful to people who needed them, people who were oppressed or people who were fighting oppression.
I mean, it makes sense. It's like it also wrote in your blood, like being an advocate for the underdog, because I read in your book that your grandfather was connected to the Leo Frank case, and then your father helped with the Voting Rights Project in the South with Dr. King and the SCLC.
Yes, indeed. My grandfather was was the lawyer who Leo Frank called in 1913 when he was arrested in Atlanta, and he was he was the manager of the Atlanta pencil factory, and there was a young white Protestant girl who was killed, and he was Jewish. And so the Hearst papers and the local populist papers by Tom Watson portrayed it as a Jewish ritual killing, and actually Leo Frank was convicted, given a death sentence, and after the governor commuted his sentence, a lynch, I wouldn't call it a mob, some of the most aristocratic families in Atlanta organized a group and took him out of prison and hung him. Ooh. And my grandfather, it set him and the Jewish community back a lot, and that was great that they defended him. They did not connect that with, I think I discovered there were some 40-some black men lynched that year in Georgia without any trials at all.
Wow.
And my dad did work with John Lewis of the Voter Education Project, which helped register really hundreds of thousands of blacks in the South.
It's like wow, listening you talk about, I'm a jazz person, and it's like you found your own way. I mean, it was like kind of like a family business, because I think about John Coltrane. John Coltrane, both his grandfathers were A.M.E. ministers, but he found a way to minister through his horn. So I just thought that was interesting, your calling. It's kind of like it was preordained for you, but in a way you had to find yourself at the same time.
Absolutely. We all get taken up by the times and by people who influence us. Obviously, one of the influences on me was Fred Hampton, both by what he did and hearing him speak. And we wanted to be lawyers for the Panthers because we were impressed by this group that stood up and said the black community should be independent and doesn't have to accept police brutality and no breakfast for kids before they went to school. And they really tried to do something about it.
How would you describe, if you were describing to, a lot of younger people, a lot of people in general don't have a true idea about the movement and what it was really all about. How would you describe the impact and the influence of Fred Hampton to a younger person?
Well, Fred had taught himself how to speak. He had memorized the speeches of Dr. King and Malcolm X, and he'd gone to church and picked up the cadence and rhythm of ministers he heard there. So he was sort of a self-taught speaker, and he had the ability to speak to welfare mothers, to law students, to gang kids, and I think that's why. And he not only talked and influenced people and inspired people like me, but he also, by his actions, wherever he went, he organized the NAACP chapter in the suburbs. He organized a group that demanded a recreation center for blacks in Maywood, Illinois, right outside Chicago, where he grew up. And then when he became the chairman of the Black Panther Party in 1968, that grew tremendously, and they had a breakfast for children program, and Fred himself would be there serving breakfast to the kids or cooking the food, just like he asked all the other Panthers to do. So it was a combination of both his inspirational words, his energy, and also just as an example of what he did.
It's like you talk about his ability to reach all these different types of people, and it seems like I look at the Panthers, what I get from reading material, and also just the media perception of the time. Even now, the Panthers were very aggressive group, and a lot of them were considered thugs. The perception of them.
Yes, and that was no accident that the FBI went out of their way to try to portray them in a way that they wouldn't get support from middle-class blacks, wouldn't get support from liberal whites, and so they deliberately misrepresented them. I think the one thing that people don't remember, first and foremost, the main thing the Panthers were trying to do was serve the community. They were not out to macho themselves or to, I was on a panel with a group of women, and somebody raised, well, weren't the Panthers really a bunch of macho guys? And she said, it's kind of interesting that two of their main programs were a breakfast program for children and a health clinic, issues that are traditionally women's issues. So I think what gets lost is the fact that they were out there to serve the community, to educate the community, and to stand up against police brutality. And yes, there was some very heavy rhetoric at the time. They were not the only ones who used it. If you even listen to Dr. King's speeches in 1968 before he died, or in 67, he was talking about shaking the foundations of this country and doing whatever was necessary to fight against militarism, racism, and imperialism. So you have to look at it in the context of those times. So yes, I think there was some rhetoric. Off the pig was one of the things they said, which they meant get police out of the community who are preying on our youth. The police may have seen it differently. But to the people, there was somebody who, hey, you could go to, and they would worked on campaigns to have community control of police. They started the Breakfast for Children program, which most cities have picked up on now. They had health clinics. They did political education. They sold newspapers. And in Chicago, they made a very strong effort to work to bring the gangs together, not to prey on the community, but to work for the community. They weren't always successful in that. They had some successes. Fred was influential with some of the gangs and some that he wasn't. But I think, above all, they weren't thugs at all, and I think when we think of thugs, we think of gangsters, or we think of gangs who prey on the people in the community, and that was not at all what the Panthers were about.
Yeah, do you remember the first time you actually met Fred Hampton, Chairman Fred?
The first time I remember was hearing him speak when he came out of jail. My partners had got him out on an appeal bond, and he came and spoke at this church, what we call the People's Church on the west side of Chicago. And it was truly inspiring. I actually have some of the words of that speech in my book. And I came in, I'd heard about Fred and everything, and the church was full, and we were, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20% white, but most of them were black students and black community people. But he stood up and he said some of the words that he's remembered by, including dare to struggle, dare to win, damn it, if you don't struggle, you don't deserve to win. And he talked about if you're not going to think about revolution or not working for the people, I don't want myself on your mind. And during that talk, he also made us stand up, or had told us to stand up, or asked us to stand up, and we did. And he said, I want you to repeat after me. And he said, I am And we said, I am. And then he said, a revolutionary. Well, I was a lawyer at that time, and I wanted to be a lawyer for the movement, but I didn't necessarily see myself as being part of the movement. But by the third or fourth time, when he said a revolutionary, the whole crowd was yelling, and I was yelling too, I am a revolutionary. And I think he had moved people beyond and just up their commitment to help people, to serve the people, to bring about dramatic change in this country. And then, of course, at the end of that speech, he gave that famous words, I'm not going to die slipping on a piece of ice. I'm not going to die of a heart attack. I'm going to die serving the people. And, in fact, 3.5 months later, the police raided his apartment, and he was killed by the Chicago police.
I had a chance to talk to his brother last week, Bill Hampton, a friend of yours, and he told me that he talked to him the night before he got killed, or the morning before. I mean, he talked to him that night before that morning raid. Right. And he had a feeling. I mean, Fred was telling him that he might not make it. He might not. He didn't. He had a feeling that it was like something about it. But I keep on thinking to myself, I don't have to play Monday morning quarterback. I don't. Like you look back on history, like there's some things you said about as well. About it's easy to talk about what could have been done now in retrospect. And considering so many folks were assassinated during that time period, and, that's a year after Dr. King being assassinated, and the type of rhetoric that he was spewing out, and also the way he was effective in organizing the masses, did anybody think about security seriously for Chairman Fred?
They talked about security. I think this was an example of their rhetoric and exceeding what they actually did. In some ways, they had a lot of security. I've talked to people who said, well, during this period, Fred, you couldn't call him directly. You had to go to 2 or 3 people to reach him. And he was also moving from house to house sometimes. And yet he got an apartment only a block away from the Panther office. And although they did have some people on security, the locks were easily broken through. There was nobody really awake and alert when the police came. So I think in many ways they understood what a threat they were. They understood that the police were out to get them, but they didn't act necessarily with that understanding in terms of security. That's my Monday morning quarterbacking, I guess you could say.
Yeah, but also, you was there. I mean, during the height of those times. I mean, just the experience, all that stuff. It was like everything was moving so fast. When I read your account and other people count things, are moving so fast. And I mean, you just trying out these new things and tactics. And when I look at how you tried the case, I like to just commend you for your steadfastness. You and Flint Taylor for y'all, dogged determination. You and your whole staff, actually, the People Law Office, in trying this case because. I mean, it was something that was brand new to y'all. It was like y'all taking on an entire system.
It was new to us, and we had some inspiring lawyers. Arthur Kanoy, who had been very active in the civil rights movement, a partner of Bill Kunstler, came and said, you guys can do it, and we got help from the Center for Constitutional Rights, the National Lawyers Guild, and NCBL, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, helped us organize the pleadings and a number of things. But when it came down to the trial and committing ourselves to an 18-month trial, it was Flint and me and one other a black lawyer named Jim Montgomery and a lot of the staff of the People's Law Office. So yeah, we remembered what Fred said, dare to struggle, and so we did go to court, and we found ourselves in a federal court in a civil rights suit, and we had mostly done criminal defense, so we had to feel our way through it. I think by the end, we were probably felt like we were as experienced lawyers as anyone in an 18-month trial with a very hostile judge.
Yeah, I mean, Judge Perry, I was really getting pissed off reading that account of Judge Perry. I mean, I really was feeling, I was like in a movie or something, just screaming at the screen. I mean, what's wrong with this guy? And I was just cheering y'all on because, man, it's 13 years, you're so modest. It took y'all 13 years, a decade and 3 years to finally see some type of justice after all this work y'all done. I mean, and you actually live your passion, because I think a lot of us always tell young folks, and even a lot of older folks, you should always live your passion, but you actually lived your passion, and it enhanced not only your professional life, but also your personal life. You met your Mary, one of your wives, at Fred Hampton's trial.
Right.
He was trying the case, and I mean, you just had all these experiences where you got a chance to meet George Jackson's mom, who encouraged you, or y'all went down to Carbondale. I mean, y'all did so many in Attica. I mean, you lived the movement, man. You like kind of like the Bolsheviks, people that went over there to witness the revolution. You was actually there participating in it.
Well, I think as one of my professors said when I was writing this book, he said you had a front row seat on history. And I feel like we did, and we probably did it without the risks that many of the other people, the revolutionaries that we served, faced. And frequently we were tempted to step over the line and not be lawyers, but I think we felt that we could serve the movement best by trying to help people. The Attica brothers is a good example. So yes, we were very close up, and things were moving very fast, as you said. In the 60s, it seemed like we were like heading for the waterfalls or the rapids. We weren't sure what was ahead, but it was a very tumultuous time. It was also a time when young people. It was really interesting. We did an interview with 7 or 8 Panthers from Chicago a few months ago, and they talked about what it was like when they formed the Panther Party, and we think of them as these mature people out there. They were young, they were students, they were looking for new ways to do things. They had found that the old methods didn't work, and so they were trying new things in terms of the community. And they were very, I think they were very brave, and they were very innovative, and, they learned a lot by what they did.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I just think it's very important people remember that they should be able to try things, that everything is not picture perfect. And that's why I love talking to people like you and also other people like elders of the veterans of that generation about how they were just trying things because they knew something had to change. Because the old ways weren't working. And they didn't know what they were going to get into, but they just tried it.
That's right. I mean, the whole civil rights movement, after being in the South and changing some of the Jim Crow laws, they realized that they hadn't really changed the conditions for urban blacks very much, where it wasn't the law on the books that said that, but it was the segregation in the unions and housing and the terrible schools and so forth. And so they began to take these issues on, and Dr. King and SCLC and SNCC and the Panthers, and they all moved to urban areas where the confrontations were a little more direct, where the police were there trying to put down anything that that white people saw as a rebellion or bringing about dramatic change. And then the other thing, as you mentioned, that when we filed this lawsuit, we knew that we had pretty much established that when the police came in, and I want to go into that in a little bit, the police raided Fred Hampton's apartment at 4:30 in the morning, and there were 14 police assigned to the prosecutor, who was running on a very law and order campaign, and they came in with a machine gun, shotguns, handguns, and a rifle, and opened fire and killed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and shot 4 of the other people in the apartment, and 3 were injured. And then they immediately tried to put out the story that they were just serving a search warrant and the Panthers attacked them. And so I was one of the people. My office was called. I went and interviewed the survivors and heard Fred's fiancée, who was 8 months pregnant with his child, with his would-be son, tell me that after the shooting had subsided somewhat, she was pulled out of the room and she heard a cop go in and where Fred was lying in the bed and say, "Is he dead yet?" And then she heard 2 shots, and then, "He's good and dead now." And while I was getting the 3 survivors who hadn't been shot their story of the raid, my partners were going to the apartment, which the police left unsealed. And we discovered by following the trajectory of the bullets, as indicated by the bullet holes, that it wasn't a shootout, it was a shoot-in. And there were over 90 shots in, and at the most 1 shot out came from the weapon of Mark Clark, who was deceased. It was probably after he had been fatally hit. It was an involuntary shot going up into the ceiling of the porchway. So and then of course there was a cover-up. Hanrahan and the police denied it. They got the Internal Investigation Division to whitewash it. They got the crime lab to claim that it was a shell that proved the Panthers fired, which turned out to be a bogus identification. So we filed a suit against all of them. But I think the really startling things we learned in the trial, and not easily, was that the Chicago police had actually been set up by the FBI pursuant to its COINTELPRO program. That they went into that apartment with a floor plan that an FBI informant had drawn and given to his contact, and that floor plan showed every room in the apartment, and it even showed the bed where Fred Hampton and his fiancée slept, and had a rectangle in the room. And we noticed that the bullets' trajectories came together where that bed was. And although the FBI at first denied any implications and so forth, they were so proud internally of what they had done, they congratulated the informant and actually gave him a bonus. And as we discovered more and more, we learned that there was this FBI program called COINTELPRO, which targeted the entire movement. It focused on the black movement. Dr. King was one of its targets. They had actually claimed they had tapes of him having an illicit affair, which they said they would make public if he didn't kill himself. And so we know that there were a number of people who were targets, but the Panthers were the biggest target of Hoover. And he put out a memo in addition to disrupt, destroy, and neutralize the Panthers by any means necessary, including their breakfast program. And one of the mandates that he gave to every FBI agent was prevent the rise of a messiah. This is the word in the FBI memo, who could unify and electrify the black nationalist movement. Well, Hoover considered all parts of the movement, black movement, to be nationalist, whether it was the NAACP or Elijah Muhammad. So here he had a memo that said, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the masses. And that was who Fred Hampton was. And we discovered that the creation of the delivery of this floor plan to the local police, together with information that there were weapons in the apartment, which was nothing new, but they used as a provocation, most of the weapons, or if not all of them, were legal, that the FBI set this thing up, and they actually gave their informant a bonus because of what they described as the success of the raid. So we had a conspiracy which started with the local police and the Hanrahan and Internal Investigation Division became much wider when we eventually added the head of the FBI in Chicago and his subordinates and O'Neill, the informant.
Now, William O'Neill, was he in charge of Chairman Fred's security?
O'Neill was, yes. When it came out that O'Neill was an informant, we all knew O'Neill. He was a very flamboyant person. He came into the party. He had certain skills, mechanical skills, and he had a big car. So for a while, he actually was in charge of security for Fred Hampton because he could drive Fred Hampton around and because he could do certain mechanical things. I think after a while, Fred began to get a little suspicious of him. O'Neill actually, in a diabolical way, he built an electric chair that he urged the Panthers to put in their entranceway to scare potential informants. And Fred finally told him to put that, to dismantle that. But O'Neill was a very clever, almost schizophrenic person. He, on the one hand, could provide the FBI with a floor plan, and 2 weeks later, Fred was killed. And at the same time, O'Neill went to Fred's parents and begged them to be a pallbearer in Fred's funeral.
Oh, wow, that man, wow. I looked at the Eyes on the Prize documentary with his with his interview, and I could see that he's a very likable guy. He's very sociable. And it's weird because he was trying to, he had some remorse, but he couldn't deal with it. He was kind of conflicted about it.
Yeah, there was sort of a progression. When we first took his deposition, he said he didn't have anything to do with the raid, and he was sorry, and he really liked the chairman. When we got his floor plan, he said, well, yes, I got the floor plan, but my control told me they didn't use the floor plan. That didn't seem very feasible because he was a very streetwise guy. As things developed, by the time and during the trial, he never took responsibility for it. By the time, many years later, that he was interviewed for Eyes on the Prize, it certainly appeared that things had begun. Either he had changed or he was willing to acknowledge that he had felt bad and felt some responsibility for it. Not completely, but there was certainly a sign of remorse. And then several years after that, he actually ran in front of a car on the Eisenhower Expressway and killed himself. So there was a progression there, and you have to think that what he did finally caught up to him.
Yeah, that's what I mean. My thing about the way that Fred Hampton and Mark Clark was killed was just like the arrogance of the government not to real. I mean, like, I feel like you all, the People Law's office, did way more than what Woodward and Bernstein done in order to uncover government corruption. I mean, like, y'all took advantage of the WikiLeaks of the time when them guys broke into the office in Pennsylvania and leaked out all this. This is before the age of the internet. And also, I mean, y'all don't have all the resources of the state. Y'all trying the state, and the state has all the taxpayer money and all the resources in the world. And here y'all on a shoestring budget, if y'all got some shoestrings, doing some incredible investigative journalism work. Better than like all the dailies were at that time. Y'all feeding the dailies all this. But to have the audacity to not really, to be so heavy-handed in killing two young activists. I mean, when you got Dr. King and Malcolm X and the Kennedy brothers, the least they went to cover up that, really, covert-wise. And you look at what they did to these two young brothers on the west side of Chicago. And for y'all to do what y'all did was extraordinary.
Well, thank you. We did have support. One of the things that turned the issue around in Chicago was the Panthers started taking people through the apartment. And people realized that, as I said, it was a shoot-in. And all the black politicians who up to that time had been beholden to Mayor Richard M. Daley, Richard J. Daley, excuse me, they had mixed feelings about the Panthers, but they didn't accept that a young black man could be killed in his bed, a young black leader, at 4:30 in the morning. And so they began to speak out. Harold Washington was a state senator, and Ralph Metcalf was a congressman, and Renault Robinson was the head of the Afro-American Patrolman League, and he called it a police murder. And so the community began to demand that a full investigation. So we did have that kind of support, and it changed the political scene in Chicago, because I think many people, I'm not the first one to say this, but I think the coalition that came together that protested the murder of Fred Hampton also elected Harold Washington mayor several years later. But we did have to, as you mentioned, the whole COINTELPRO program was discovered when some people who were opposed to the war in Vietnam raided an FBI office and discovered this secret program that the FBI had not acknowledged. And the other information we got, the floor plan and the bonus document and everything, it wasn't, WikiLeaks, it was a little, we would ask for things over and over and over again, and we had the benefit of the church committee was also investigating. But that's why it took so long. In the middle of our trial, the FBI discovered 200 volumes of files on the Panthers and Fred Hampton that they had failed to turn over. So we had a lot. We were supposed to try the case and read these thousands and thousands of pages. The judge wouldn't suspend the trial or give us a mistrial. So, it turned into a big thing. But there are some definitely comparisons to WikiLeaks, to the Pentagon Papers that came out. And as you said, a lot of this discovery came about through the raiding of the FBI office in Pennsylvania.
It also is y'all just being determined to see this ship through the storms. Because I look at the fact, I'd also go farther to say that this opened the way up to Obama. Many years, not that long ago. Because he came out of Chicago, right?
He came out of Chicago, and I think he wouldn't have come to Chicago to do community organizing if Harold Washington hadn't been the mayor and he hadn't seen some kind of progressive government there or progressive, possibilities. So yes, I think you could say that Obama in many ways benefited from that and came to Chicago and made his base because of the coming together of black progressive forces and some white liberals.
Yeah, I always tell people this too. I said that they took Chairman Fred from us. Like I talk about the Daily Machine, but they took Chairman Fred and and Harold Washington had to fight against the machine to be elected through the coalition. And the Daily Machine, in an ironic way, gave us Obama too.
Yes, it did. And you can I'm sure people have different opinions about what that means, you know. But yes, I think that the daily machine liberalized or had to in order to keep. You can't get elected in Chicago if you don't have a substantial part of the black vote. Mm-hmm. So I think it did change the machine, and they became a lot smoother, and actually gave, I think, more autonomy to black aldermen and congressmen.
I was going to talk about a quote you did about, the faith of the 60s. I know somebody, I don't know who the exact person was, in the cabinet of Harold Washington, said that the people who took out the leaders of the movement of the 60s made it their business to take out the right ones. They got the right ones. And I want to say a quote you said about, about Fred Hampton's legacy, but also what happened to the West Side. You said, of course, there's also the legacy that without a young leader, I think the West Side of Chicago degenerated a lot into drugs. And without leaders like Fred Hampton, I think the gangs and the drugs became much more prevalent on the West Side. He was our alternative to that. He talked about serving the community. He talked about breakfast programs, educating people, community control of police. So I think that that's unfortunately another legacy of Fred's murder. That's one, another part of that murder. Because when I think about that, I think about the situation what happened with Darian Albert and the person who killed him, how he was sentenced as an adult. And also I thought about years earlier, I believe it was like 1990, where Time Magazine, I guess they had a Slow News Week or Life of one of them, had a picture of Robbie Yummy Semmiford on the front cover. Mm-hmm. 11-year-old gangbanger out of Chicago got killed, whatever. And that always stayed with me, kind of like, when people first saw the picture of Emmett Till or something like that. And I keep on thinking about what would Chairman Fred have done if he was able to mature. So you made a great point in your book. What if they took George Washington away, or Thomas Jefferson, some of the leaders of the forefathers of the Revolution, away during the implementation of the Young Republic? Or you see what happened with Haiti, when Toussaint Overture was taken away by Napoleon. So, you made some great points in the book about that.
I do think, looking at history, that leaders are important, and that they direct and provide energy for the movement. And, who would say that without a George Washington, who would say without a Ho Chi Minh, who would say without Fidel and Che, that any of these revolutions wouldn't have succeeded, I think they play a tremendous role. And also the assassination creates the opposite effect, and people are fearful, and they don't think they can win, and they think the state's all powerful. So at the same time, we were, saying Chairman Fred lives, and the revolution, you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill a revolution. That's a little too easy. That's a little too simplistic, because I think, in fact, you have a great effect if you kill a revolutionary leader.
I definitely agree. I want to ask you what made you decide to write the book at this point in your life? Were you thinking about not writing the book, or just wait for the right time?
I was really, for the many years, for probably the next 30 or 25 years after we finished the case, I was a pretty active civil rights lawyer in Chicago, and we were just dealing hot and heavy with everything from the Pontiac Prisoners' Rebellion to Attica to defending the anti-war movement, Iranian students, SDS, peace movement, and so forth. So, at that time, and then it turned out, well, gosh, it's been 35 years. I moved out to New Mexico, even though I was still doing some civil rights work. And I had the time to do it. And I thought, it's been 35 years, nobody's written this story. So I started writing it, and probably would have written a pretty dull book as a lawyer, sort of arguing my points, repeating them, trying to anticipate everything someone else might say, which is what lawyers have to do when you write something for the court. And then a friend of mine, actually it was Bill Ayers, said, well, look, I went back and got an MFA in creative nonfiction from Bennington. Why don't you do that? So I did, and so I wanted to tell it like a story and make it a personal memoir as well as a documenting what happened in history. So it took me 4 or 5 years to do it, but I wanted to write something interesting and something that people would, be readable and not just have the information there. So it took a while, but once I really got into it, I realized the story needed to be told.
It's a fantastic read. It reads, it's like a screenplay or something. Like I look at the you and Flint back in y'all day. You look like a Starsky and Hutch or something. And I was wondering who you want to play you in the movie version of this book. I mean, it was great. It'll make a hell of a movie.
Well, there is somebody, we actually, somebody has optioned the movie rights. His name is Chris Smith. He's a director, and he's working on a screenplay right now, so I'm really hopeful that it will become a movie, and we'll see what happens.
I think it's very important because I look at how, there's a lot of controversy. Like, there's a lot of, I look at the civil rights movement, it's like a lot of intergenerational leadership and partnerships. Like, you had, A. Philip Randolph working with Dr. King, or you had, like, A.L.L or anybody, they all come from different generations, but they all got the same objective in mind. And I look at, like, when I think about Chairman Fred, and I think about, I tie him with Tupac, because Tupac was a Panther Cub. Given his family background in the Panther civil rights movement. And, they had this rhetoric, that was larger than themselves. They were very charismatic figures. But also, in a lot of ways, they were very tragic figures. Because I don't think people understood how to really truly utilize what they had, or even themselves. It was great what they had, but it's like it was so overwhelming that they were willing to say, you know what, I'm not going to live a long time, but let me just put everything out there. But at the same time, people misunderstood what they were saying because it's like the powers that be, they also amplified, but they didn't amplify all the right things they were saying. They took things out of context. So I think that's why your book was so important. So to this book, along with the Murder of Fred Hampton's documentary, made by some of your friends, Mike Gray and Howard Hawk, and the Eyes on the Prize series, these are like the people's history that need to be told. You're like in that tradition of Howard Zinn. This is a very important work.
Well, I appreciate that, and I do think it's important. It's important to people to know the facts of that history and also to get a feeling for the times and to see what was done in the context of those times. So I agree with you, and I think the documentary was excellent. The documentary was done before we knew about the FBI role, so that part isn't in there. But I think the hearing, the speeches of Fred Hampton and the filming of The Apartment. One of my partners I'm still kind of amazed thinking about it, but as soon as we heard that there had been this raid, while I was interviewing the survivors, one of my partners got a filmmaker, Mike Gray, and a minister, and went to the apartment and started filming it, what it looked like when the police left. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the documentary, the murder of Fred Hampton. So I think it really has a lot of authenticity and a lot to learn.
That was Skip Andrew. I really was impressed by him because both of you guys, he was from North Carolina, I believe. You're from Atlanta. Y'all from the South, and they have the type of families y'all have. But I thought he made a great point. The book you made about, he really wanted to be a part of this movement. He helped, bring the case against the government about the murders of Fred and Mark. But he was like, he didn't want to be poor at the same time. It's like a lot of times, I talk to a lot of my peers, a lot of us want to do the right thing like you all did, but we don't want to struggle. We don't want to be destitute. We don't want to go to school with all these student loans and have nothing to show for it in terms of materialistic gain.
Well, I think, there's a privilege that we had, too, also. Most of us in the 60s who came out of law school, we didn't come out with a $100,000 loan to pay back with the pressure to take a paying job. Mm-hmm. And, I guess it was also a lifestyle thing. We sort of lived collectively. We didn't have children at that time. We didn't have a lot of overhead. We opened our office in a former sausage shop on the street. And I think that's hard to replicate today, and I sympathize with people, and I don't think it's an accident that they burden students with all these loans, so that then they're forced to kind of take straight jobs. But I think if you're really committed, you can find a way. Sometimes there are these really good loan forgiveness programs if you do public interest work. So I think it's harder in some ways, but I think if you're determined, you can find a way to serve the people as a lawyer or in any other field.
I just think about that time period, though, like, people was willing to serve, like you said, every generation has a point where they can decide to define a revolution on their own terms. Like, every generation has a point or a moment or event or whatever, everything comes together. You going to serve or you ain't going to serve. And I looked at the fact that, you went to school with John Ashcroft, of all people. Every time heaven came there, you were so right.
Yeah, you sort of like you read about George Bush or something, when he was a student, and I'm sure people thought he was, a nerd or a neb or somebody who he doesn't have anything to say. He's quiet and not very interesting. And that's sort of the way we viewed Ashcroft, because his perspective, his right-wing perspective, was definitely out of vogue in the 60s.
Let me ask you this. Do you think things have gotten progressively worse in terms of government responsibility and accountability? I mean, you look at the things that happened since December 4th, 1969, in terms of, I could just say Katrina, or even 9/11.
I think that's a really good question. And I heard Bobby Rush, who was the deputy chairman and has been a congressman, and he stood up and said, I think conditions for many black people are worse today than they were 40 years ago in 69. And I said that sort of on a radio interview last week with Cornel West. And I think he corrected me. He said, well, you can't ignore the fact that for many, many blacks, things have gotten substantially better in 40 years. And for the many, many blacks, they haven't gotten better and probably have gotten worse. So I think it's sort of like a mixed bag, that some of the limitations that were put on blacks, whether it was going to a restaurant or getting a housing or certain jobs, if you make it through a terrible public education system and somehow get an education and get motivated in spite of conditions in the community, I think things are probably better for you. But I think in terms of the general treatment of the community educational system, police brutality, that hasn't changed very much. Housing and so forth, the gang situation in many cities. So I think, we made a lot of progress sort of in the 60s in some areas, but I think this movement, the right-wing movement has really, and I think jobs for blacks have really, and for everybody. And I was on one panel, and one of the black history professors stood up and said, when they talk about cutting public jobs, who do you think will hold those jobs? Who has a higher percentage of jobs as school teachers, as nurses, as postal workers, So this is going to make things worse. And I think the other thing is that one of the bases for Fred Hampton, in addition to students, was people in the community. And now that we have this mass incarceration of blacks, the criminalization of young black men and Hispanic men. So, and those things are perhaps more subtle and less harder, and they're a little bit harder to take on. But they're certainly, for many, 2 million people, more than 2 million are in jail, majority of which are young people for drug offenses. Right. And as I don't know if you're probably familiar with this woman, Michelle, what's her name?
Was it Jim Crow?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about how these mass programs of the drug war and the crime war weren't based on an increase in drugs or crime, and in fact, as she points out, there's as much drugs in the white community as there is in the black community, but the enforcement was all against blacks. So you could make a strong case that for some things have gotten better, and there is an entry into the middle class that they may not have been, but for large numbers that's not true, and prisons and terrible schools persist. And it seems like with this right-wing movement in this country, things are only going to get worse for working people.
Yeah, I would just say that I agree with you more so than Dr. Cornel West on this one, because I look back 40-some years ago, we was a producer society. Our economy was about producing. We had factories. Our economy was actually expanding, which means there was a greater pie to get for everybody. I mean, it was enough for everything to go around. It still is, I think, in a lot of ways, it's about perception. But I look at Chicago, for example. That's the third largest school system in the country, public school. Yeah, you got on average like 30-something kids getting killed every year, going to and from school, and not necessarily involved in gangs. But the lack of understanding, then you got, who's our Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, who's been married. He was literally married into the Daily Machine.
Absolutely.
Education, and he's trying to militarize everything. I don't agree with military thing. I know you served in the service, and, it was interesting to talk about your experience in the service. But I think in a lot of ways they're limiting people where they got no choice but to either go to prison or to the military, because there's no factories, and the economy is not really expanding in terms of you can have a living wage for the average working person.
I agree. I don't think Dr. West disagreed with us. He said for some people things have gotten better, but he didn't say that was true for the majority of black people.
Yeah, all the majority of people right now, because I know middle class, that's evaporating too, because I look at the Montgomery bus boycott. You actually had a black middle class. You had black business owners back then, and they would do certain things. But now, I mean, if you're living from paycheck to paycheck and you can barely pay your mortgage and your car note, that's not really middle class to me. That's just like upper poor.
Well, we see that the wealth is getting more and more compacted in the top 1% of the population. And I think that, I think the 1% of the population now has 25 to 30% of the wealth, whereas 30 years ago it was like 10 to 13% of the wealth. And so that concentration and everything that gets passed, these tax bills that give big bonuses to the wealthy people, cut their taxes, cut their estate taxes, and then they're going to turn around and say, well, now we're so much in debt, we have to cut Social Security and Medicaid and programs that serve regular people.
Yeah, there's a crap. Like you talk about the criticism of the Black Panther Party and some of the praises, they actually address the issues that our government, with our resources, looks like they want to address. With the health clinics and feeding kids. I mean, like you said, you touch upon it. And I look at, it's sad that, like Chairman Fred and them guys, it's like they don't want to make no more Chairman Freds or no more Dr. Kings and Malcolms. They want indoctrinated black men, but they don't want no educated black men. Because they're dangerous for the status quo, and they'll empower the masses.
It's true. I mean, I think, you kill one person like that, it becomes an example for other people, and then you take away a lot of the base and imprison them, or you'd miseducate them, and, they certainly don't want any kind of threat to the status quo.
Well, I would say that, like, to me, like, that's a travesty because a lot of us depend on these corporate news outlets. I don't know call them mainstream, because I think what you and I are talking about is mainstream. It's like something that concerns us mainly, and concerns our lives. But I look at corporate news, and like I tell people all the time, it's not even news, it's this opinion that's been like, loudmouths that don't really respect any type of, let me finish my thought, and then you get a chance to say what you got to say. But these folks are controlled by military contractors who work with the Pentagon. I mean, how can you trust news from Katie Couric and Brian Williams, and so when their paychecks are signed by people like General Electric and Westinghouse? Supposedly got contracts with the military, with the Pentagon.
We do get a very skewed version of things, and you really have, of course, on the Internet, you have a much bigger choice, and I think democracy now gives us a lot of truth about what's going on in the world. And there are other outlets that do that, but yes, it's hard, to find out the truth. And the corporate media, the discussion there, is very limited. We never get a real thorough discussion of what we did to Iraq or what's really happening in Afghanistan.
Right.
We get sort of, one set of the part of the military says things are going great, and the other part says, well, maybe they're not going so good. We just need to plug around, and stories like 55% of the people in Afghanistan want to get the U.S. out, and 60% in Iraq want the U.S. out, and how many millions of people have been killed there and disrupted, and refugees, and, it's all, how's the war going from our perspective, not what's it like for the people who live there.
You know what, that's why we miss it. I was really, it saddens me to know. I look at Chairman Fred, and Dr. King had a lot of admiration for Chairman Fred. A lot of folks did. I mean, but I'm saying these guys, like what Malcolm said, you got to make it plain. These kids like Fred Hampton at 21 was able to break down these type of social economic commentary where a person with a third grade education can understand it. And that made him famous.
He absolutely did. He simplified things. In the same way, he was sort of eloquent and powerful as a speaker, and Dr. King did the same thing. You read his speeches. People a lot read his "I Have a Dream" speech, which was a beautiful speech. But later on, when he, when he stood up, and all of a sudden the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement came together, and he took all of the moral, fervor that he could muster, and said, we can't, as black people, we who have been oppressed, we have a special duty not to oppress other people, and including the Vietnamese. And that just added a tremendous amount of energy and insight, and, all of a sudden it seemed like we were fighting the same enemy in different forms.
Well, I've always looked at the fact, like, the Chairman Fred, like, I mean, I would say he came from a middle-class background, but the ability to be able to reach these street gangs, I think if Chairman Fred was alive, the Tea Party would be better educated and might be on the side of the people that they need to be on the side of. If he was
it's kind of amazing, the Tea Party. I mean, I think whenever economic times get bad, people who are harmed by it are looking for a scapegoat. That's what happened in Germany,
of course.
And they're really vulnerable to getting whipped up and become right wing. And of course, the tremendous amount of the money backing for the Tea Party is corporate money, is Murdoch and the money that goes into Fox and Glenn Beck and all of those people. So it's not exactly a legitimate movement. One of the funny things, they said the Tea Party was supposed to be this grassroots movement of disenfranchised and unemployed people. Their third highest priority was reducing the estate tax.
Right.
Exactly. So, there's something phony about that.
We got, like I tell people, we got a lot of well-educated folks and not a lot of well-informed people. I mean, you can be educated in ways of how to be able to be a critical thinker, but to actually be well-informed is a totally different mindset. So I just look at the fact that, I mean, like I said, like writing this book, like the fact that when Judge Perry, like you said in the book, I mean, like if people in the jury were able to understand the type of person Chairman Fred was, well, somebody like Judge Perry playing gatekeeper for the powers that be, to question them. And I mean, y'all probably won their case in the 18 months. How can you have a case for 18 months and not have no evidence?
Yeah, well, I mean, you do get judges that are, and I think you're getting more and more of them today, appointed by these right-wing, certainly appointed by Bush, who are ideologically opposed to certain things. Now we have a Supreme Court that basically sides on the behalf of business in every case, even declaring that business's First Amendment rights to control elections is more important than the people's right to have fair elections. That the corporations can give as much money as they want to a candidate and don't even have to disclose it. And that's totally antithetical to democracy.
You know what the thing about it, I want to ask you this too, because I think it's very important, because I look at the 60s, like, it was not only a trial and error for you young activists, but also for the powers that be, because they show too much on TV. I mean, the movement could not happen without propaganda, like being, showing dogs getting sicked on children and women and men down south of water hoses. The media played an important part in actually amplifying the movement. And I think now, I mean, they don't even want to show caskets coming home from Iraq. And I was wondering, with your knowledge, all your experience and your insight, could a Chairman Fred Hampton happen today?
I think probably they could. I mean, it would take a different form, and I don't know if he'd have the exact issues, but I think the contradictions in the world have not lessened very much. I think the U.S. is still involved in imperialist wars that are killing people abroad and draining the community of important resources, of course, including people. And so I think the issue of climate change, in which the big corporations and coal companies are threatening the future generations of our planet, require people to begin to stand up and say, my children are more important than the corporations that utilities that want to burn coal or that want to use, get all this oil as much as they can. And so if people really understood that, certainly the corporate control of the power and the connection between corporations and the government here has never been clearer. And I don't think the detrimental effects have been clearer than they are now, both in this country and abroad. So I think the issues are there, and I think if somebody could, really capture them in a clear way, they could be a leader or several leaders emerging.
Yeah, I always tell people, I just think that sometimes, I don't know, I mean, I look at what's going on right now. We talked about your ability to be educated. You got access to public libraries. But every time I go to the public library, I see young people on the computer, on YouTube, on MTV.com or something like that. And when I talk to young people, I always tell them, I'm not that old, but I'm just saying, I think about it in terms of what would Chairman Fred be doing with Facebook. What Harry told me doing with MySpace or Twitter. And the thing about it is, these folks had limited resources.
Yeah.
And it happened. Here we got like a gluttony of opportunity, yet we so blind that we can't see the forest for the trees. Because we don't know the history.
Yeah, I mean, I think those resources certainly can be used to educate us. On the other hand, they isolate us. They become our whole connection. They become our method of entertainment, you know, whether it's video games or emailing people, or instead of getting out in the streets, we push a button and protest, you know, send a letter to a congressperson.
That's so true. Oh, my God. We the last days of the Roman Empire. Is this really the end? This how it's going to end. Everybody obese and sitting in their rooms, can't get out of Twitter and then text messages. I mean, this is just ridiculous.
Yeah,
it's a contradiction. It's a huge contradiction.
I know, it's really true, and somehow we got to use those methods as best we can to educate ourselves, but they're not a substitute for actually coming together. I think one of the things that was when I wrote this book and recall those days of the 60s was that we had a sense of power. We had a sense that we could change things. We actually got a president to resign over his stance around the Vietnam War.
Right.
And you know, and some of that came from being out in the streets together and marching together. And you don't get that when you sit at home and you're pushing a button and you're watching TV and everybody's, you know, sort of atomized. And I think figuring out ways to bring us together and get a sense of what our power could be is one of the, you know, urgencies of this period.
That's so true, because I also think it's a poison, because I think I had a chance to interview some of the families and lawyers, one of the first people to do so over here, an Agenda 6 miner. And I'm friends with one of the people in Agenda 6, Michael Bell's father, but I think that our problem was we thought that if everybody would come down to Agenda for one day and have a big old march and sing and all this other stuff, that would solve the problem. And I said, we got Agenda 6s all over the place. It's a systemic issue. It's not just like put out a fire here when the whole system is not setting everything on fire. It's like it's no coincidence that the things that are going on in Memphis is happening in Detroit and Chicago and in Oakland and all over the place. Is the fact we're not taking on the system and we're not creating an alternative. We're not strategizing. And we're not, you know, thinking about these type of things. Like, even, like, y'all did marching, but it was like y'all had the courts. You used your activism in the court. And some folks went to the streets, but it was like you fought on many different fronts. Like in World War II, you had many different theaters of operation in order to win the war.
You're right, and you know, we used to have these debates. Is it better to be a lawyer or a political activist? Do you change things through the court or do you change things through the streets? And what we discovered is the information we learned in the courts we felt was important, not maybe just to win a case, but that the people needed to know it. So that the courts became a vehicle for uncovering government abuse and sometimes getting redress for it, but was not the end-all and be-all, you know, so that it sort of was a false argument, because in order, and more recently, if you're familiar with Chicago, our office uncovered that this police commander named John Burge was torturing people.
Right, for years.
Suspects, and it took 30, 25 years to get the world to see that. And we would use the information we discovered in law cases to go public and to create demonstrations and to get articles written. And it took a long time to bring John Burge to trial. He's going to be sentenced next month in January.
Wow. But I mean, they don't teach that type of determination in law schools today. I'm not saying I know. I got a lot of lawyer friends. They don't think about that. They thinking about, you know, I ain't worried about, you know, tomorrow. Let's do what we can today. Let's get paid today. We're not worrying about tomorrow. You know, we're not thinking about legacy. I don't think y'all thinking about legacy per se when y'all did this, but y'all opened up a whole Pandora box when y'all just took on the Fred Hampton and Matt Clark case. I mean, that opens. You educated people so much. I mean, it's like Brown v. Board to me, because y'all, you know, the largest civil suit settlement of that time, to actually get the government to say that we did terrorize our own citizens because they wanted to feed kids and give people universal health care. I mean, to get them to actually say anything on record, that was amazing to me. That was if you didn't do anything after that, you did your contribution to humanity in terms of fighting the good fight for the people, to empower the people. But I think a lot of times, like, you know, for example, I go to the stores now, I'm afraid to give the cash register person money because a lot of times I don't get the correct change back. It's not that I mean, like our education system is actually catching up with how we poorly miseducated a lot of folks. Like, I don't get correct change back. Even the medicine can't count change. And I'm afraid. I need every penny I got. But I'm saying, but people are not, you know what I'm saying? It's not that they're got character issues. They just don't know how to count. They don't know how to do simple arithmetic.
Well, I think the taking away of resources from our educational system is one of the biggest disasters that's happening. And you read these statistics that the United States is 82nd in the world in this and 45th in this, and everything is becoming privatized, and that's the movement here to privatize things. And yes, I was down in New Orleans not too long ago, and it was really stark because the education system that's been set up after Katrina for about half the population is quite good for the middle class and so forth, and for the rest it's terrible. They don't even have any teachers, textbooks, or anything. And so this whole, as somebody's talked about, it sort of like America's, like the green zoning in Iraq. There's a special privileged group that has everything, and for the rest of the people, there's the minimum.
I mean, they try to create a permanent underclass, like a class of untouchables. I mean, that's what they're doing. I mean, like somebody told me, they trying to, do population control. I don't know you being too much of conspiracy theories, but you did the Fred Hampton thing, and you know that there are conspiracies out there that are conspiring against the people to limit their potential. And so, like they said, they trying to divide people into two different categories. You got the useful idiots and the wasteful eaters, and they try to downsize the wasteful eaters. So, I mean, they basically getting rid of a lot of us. And like people say, well, that's crazy, Ron. We got free will. But yeah, but I'm saying, if they saying this is food and this is the Food and Drug Administration, they okaying food that's making you sick, or things are not food, or they're doing things where your quality of life is very limited because you need health care. You deserve health care. Everybody gets sick. Everybody gotta get taken care of every now and then. So it's a quality of life issue. But when I go to town hall meetings or when I hear people, I read the comment section on the online newspapers, and folks complain about spending $10,000 on a child for education, but yet we don't have a problem when the federal government placed trillions and trillions of dollars without any type of accountability. It's okay for us to blow up poor people, but to empower poor people, is a problem.
You're right. I mean, and unfortunately, it's getting worse, not better. And this whole get the government out of our lives. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean? These regulations. I mean, government's supposed to be regulating stuff and be open.
And the government's supposed to provide health care, and the government's supposed to provide decent schools, and the government's supposed to provide Social Security. And the government should be taking a strong role around clean energy in setting pollution limits and making it impossible for these coal-burning coal-burning electricity generating plants to exist and contribute to basically what could be global warming and the eventual creating of an uninhabitable planet.
Well, actually, this because you on point with everything. I mean, I'm just glad you took the path that you took because it's very inspiring to me. It gives me a lot of hope that I'll be okay. But I want to ask you this because we got Nixon now, right? We look at what Nixon done in comparison to Dick Cheney and the Bush administration.
Yeah.
And Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld worked for Nixon and people like that, and Gerald Ford.
Absolutely. I mean, when the abuses of COINTELPRO came out and Watergate, and the Senate wanted to put some limit on the FBI and CIA, it was Rumsfeld and Cheney, that time working for Ford, who opposed it.
You get the right people there. That's what I'm saying. The criminals always prosper.
Yeah, and then, of course, they had their day later on and did everything they could to put in a system where, taking away our rights and creating, unfortunately, much of that has not been dismantled by Obama. And right now, there was recently the FBI raided the office of a group in Chicago that does support work for Palestinians, and now they've given these people subpoenas to go to a grand jury, and if they don't talk, they'll put them in jail.
It's a deja vu. I mean, I just don't understand what it's going to take for. I mean, I just look at, you just said it. It's happening in the same place with Chairman Fred and Marquardt got killed 42 years ago. I mean, in the city. But the mentality of, the FBI is trapping people and setting folks up. Even when you talk about Merlin Johnson, who sent that crazy letter to Jeff Ford, and Jeff Ford didn't drink the Kool-Aid on it. He knew better. I mean, I like the way, and then like the even William Sullivan, who was like number 2, I believe, who wrote the letter told Dr. King to kill himself. I mean, these guys have did so much irreparable damage. I mean, it's ridiculous. Then the fact that you got these same people behind the scenes in this shadow government. I know the death of investigative journalism in this country. I saw Bill Moyer's secret government piece he did, I believe, back in '87 about Iran-Contra. Mm-hmm. And for a guy to even be like the press secretary of Lyndon B. Johnson, for him to do the type of piece he did back in '87 was amazing to me, because, I mean, it shows you how much journalism has went down in this country. It's more like cheerleading, because it's more like yellow journalism now, where, you have to watch them Post and New York Times, they cheerleading us into war. But I'm looking for the framed churches, and the people that are like the framed churches, like the Sister Paul Wellstones and Dennis Kuciniches and people like that, they get marginalized or they get rid of them.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, all of those are very good examples of, and the same thing is sort of happening with they're trying to criminalize Assange now around the WikiLeaks stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy to me. He did a hell of a job. I commend him for what he did.
Yeah.
Real journalism, because people don't want to think about what's going on. Even the Gulf spill, you had folks down there saying, "I don't care about the environment. Just give me a job."
Exactly, and it's sort of set up as though, well, do you care about the environment or do you have a job? And in reality, the jobs in the 21st century are going to come through green energy, are going to come through wind and solar and alternative energy forms. They're not going to be coming, doing, mountaintop removal and working in coal-powered power plants, coal-burning powered plants. And the rest of the world sees this. It's like we're going backwards. Like, Europe and China and everything understand and are, developing all these solar technologies, so that we have to buy solar panels from China because this country is still debating climate change, whereas the rest of the world is either trying to adapt to it or trying to take advantage of it, and we're pretending like it doesn't exist.
I mean, yeah, I just look at the whole thing. That's why I say I don't want to say I'm cynical of the whole system, but I just don't buy it. I just don't think that. I got friends of mine who are teachers, and they're very community oriented, and they keep on telling me we got to go in the system to change the system. So you can't change something that ain't broken. This is the way it's supposed to work. They're going to change you if you keep on thinking like that, because you got to give an alternative to the system. Like even Thomas Jefferson said, if it don't work, you got to get rid of it.
Right.
And it's supposed to be at the same time. The forefathers didn't trust the American public or the people. Why would they create a Senate? Mm-hmm. But the Senate, to me, is the biggest problem to a lot of things.
Yeah, it definitely is. There's no question about that. Anything progressive, it prevents.
Well, let me actually just I really enjoyed talking to you. I know I can talk to you all day. I mean, you're a great person, and I just want to give you your praises because, I mean, people got to get their flowers before they go. I believe in doing that, and I think that this has really, Chairman Fred has really inspired me. And you ensured that his death was not in vain, that he lives forever, that you actually resurrected a Messiah.
One of the reasons I wrote the book was because very few people knew about Fred Hampton. Some knew about his death. Very few knew about his life. And so I did try to humanize him, not just as the victim, but who he was and why he was a threat. And so I spent some time with his family and with his friends and, getting their view of him. So I do think it does that, and I'm going to, I appreciate your comments, and the book is the assassination of Fred Hampton, how the FBI and Chicago police murdered a Black Panther. You can learn more about the book at www.hamptonbook.com, which has the blurbs by a lot of people. It has an excerpt from the book, a little bit about me, and, of course, they can order it from, hopefully, their local independent bookstore or from Amazon or any of the bookstores.
Yeah, I just appreciate it. Thank you for saying all that. I think people need to know about it because I'm just going to write a review of it. And so the best way to get in touch with you is through that website, correct? Hampton.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's my actual email address is Jeffrey Haas 42@gmail.com.
Okay, definitely. I'll definitely put it out there. I just really appreciate you taking the time. I really enjoyed the book. I really think it's important, and that's why I'm concerned about a lot of things because the media has not done its job. Like Ida B. Wells Barnett, one of my heroes, She said it's up to the media to inform the people so they can act. You know, it's up to people not being informed about the clean energy. They're not being given. Like I just like I look at. I'm gonna let you go after this. I look at. I limited my intake of cable news because every time I look at some show, they talk about we're delivering hard news. No, you just give me your opinion, and everybody, opinions like everybody got an a-hole. Yeah. And what opinions are? I mean, you're not giving us hard news. You're not asking hard questions. They're very flaccid. And it's all about getting the correspondence dinner, but getting invited to the party.
Most of the network news is right. It's a repeat of sort of what the government's position is or what they put out in their press releases or what the standard understanding is, and very seldom do they really go. They go into so much the how is this going to play for the Democrats and how is this going to play for the Republicans, and instead of how does climate change affect all of us? What does it mean? Not just how many Democrats are for it and how many Republicans are against it, but how important is this issue, and what does it mean for the next generations that the planet is heating up and that we're going to have hundreds of millions of refugees from countries that there's no more snow melting into their rivers, and the hurricanes are worse, and So.
I mean, that's so true to think about. Well, thank you, Brother Jeffrey House, and I hope you enjoy yourself.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the interview, and I appreciate you.
Hey, we definitely be in touch. Cause I'm really inspired by you giving me some renewed hope in humanity. Yeah, I trust that. I mean, it's important work, and I think every time I go somewhere, I try to make it my business to educate folks about people like Chairman Fred and the sacrifices that we can't take for granted and that we should be building on right now. Because I think it's very important because you got a lot of folks. It's like the only way that you could be successful in the system is you got to dumb everything down.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the interview, and I hope people read the book, and I hope people listen to you.
I hope so, too. But don't take my word for it. It's like reading Rainbow Time. You got to read it for yourself.
Okay.
All right, Brother Hall.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.